Hi, Stu Stover again. I wanted to start moving towards the Great Depression. So we've talked a little bit about what happened with the banking crisis of 1907, rise of the Federal Reserve, and so there were a number of other things that showed up in this time period. So in this time period we also get the introduction of the income tax. So there's the notion of the federal government having to fund itself by some other means other than just tariffs. What had happened is the amount of tariff revenue had just dried up, so there was no ability to fund stuff just from that particular source. And so as we get into World War I, you've got to have funding source to keep the war machine going. And so one of the things that we look at with the 1910s is you have what we would loosely call fiscal policy. So the government is spending piles of money, not only hiring, training soldiers, but you got to equip them, you got to send them overseas, you got to have food, you got to bullets. I mean, you got to have the whole thing. And so the government is actually dumping a lot of money into society, which stimulates the society. So unemployment tends to drop, wages go up, lots of short-term effects are pretty good with all that. But in that era, when World War I ends, what does the federal government do? They kick all those folks back out of the military, back into society. Lots of issues with that, but the reality is, instead of pumping all this money into society, you're now pulling it out of society in some sense, constricting the economy. So 1919 was kind of tough economically, but it didn't actually last long. It was one of the things most economists thought this was going to be another depression that might well happen as we got into the early 1920s. But interestingly enough, it didn't. So one of the reasons that it didn't happen is we had this astonishing boom of consumerism. So you had people making more money, and if you're going to buy more money, all of a sudden you can buy a car, you can buy a radio, you can buy a refrigerator, you can buy some early version of the washing machine. All of those things were starting to happen. And so all of a sudden the emphasis switched from the government sort of stimulating the economy to us stimulating the economy. And that actually worked just great for a long time in the 1920s. But there's a problem with that. The people with money, how many of them are there, and how much money do they have, and how many cars do they need, how many refrigerators do they need, how many, whatever. And so we got to some saturation point that there weren't enough new consumers who had the resources to be true consumers in the sense, and so that some of that kind of ran out a bit in the 1920s. But we also had the issue in agriculture. Agriculture was still, in many ways, the dominant enterprise in America. So lots and lots of small, itty-bitty little farms, tenant farmers, all sorts of stuff. And what is happening in the 1920s? The boom in agricultural technology was just going through the roof. So it wasn't just tractors and plows and combines and all the other stuff, but it was also better seed. It was better fertilizer and some other things that just dramatically shot up the productivity of the average farmer. Okay, so if you produce all these goods in a classic free market system, if you produce a surplus of agricultural goods, what happens to the prices? They plummet. What happens to the income of the farmers? So many farmers discovered that they were making less when they sold their crops than it costs to plant the crops. Is that a good scenario? Probably not. So what you had is just tremendous turmoil in agriculture. You also had turmoil in Europe and other places, so you couldn't sell the surplus anywhere in the world, which, so all of a sudden you got all this surplus, and what do you do with it? So what you had is just a tremendous shrinking of the number of people that were in agriculture. Well, that wasn't a big deal, because in the 1920s, what did we do? Okay. So I'm going to do this real easy here. Normally I'd do it much bigger, but you've got people who work in agriculture, people who work in building. Okay, so most of the skylines in major cities in America were built in the 1920s, and so they were construction workers. And then you've got manufacturing. And so the theory in the 1920s is, if we had surplus agriculture workers, what would they do? They would go to the city and they would be construction workers. If we had a surplus of construction workers, they would go over to manufacturing. And you look at some of those old clips of car factories back in the day, and you had thousands of people in those factories, just astonishing numbers of people. And so people would jump over from one school or one category to the next. And the idea was, it's all unskilled labor, so unskilled labor can go wherever it is needed. Very different than today's model in all sorts of ways. And similarly, if the assumption is we got too many workers in manufacturing, what do? They jump back over to agriculture or wherever they go. Well, what happens as we get into the later 1920s? Agriculture is in free fall. The number of workers we need is in free fall. We've already built all these wonderful buildings in New York City and Boston and Chicago and everywhere else. We don't need to build any more buildings. So that's kind of down. In manufacturing, what are we seeing in manufacturing? We've kind of saturated the market in terms of the people who can afford it. Now, you got to remember, Henry Ford came along with something called the $5 day. Okay, was he a wonderful guy? No. Henry Ford was a terrible guy. He was a pro-Hitler. And so he actually gave out copies of Mein Kampf to his executives, because he thought that was the solution, particularly as we got into the Great Depression. That was the solution for America, to have somebody like that, a dictator, authoritarian figure solving our problems. But why did he do a $5 day? Some of his plants were running 60% turnover a month. How do you run an assembly line with 60% turnover a month? And so people were jumping from one place to another. So when we went to the $5 day, it was not so much an issue that he wanted to pay the workers, and the workers would then have enough money to hopefully afford to buy a car from Ford. I mean, that's a secondary effect that happened from all this. But it was really an issue to lower his turnover rate. And it did plummet to very low levels, the turnover, because they could make more money on the assembly line at Ford. It also gave us this American illusion that you can buy people's loyalty by paying them more money, and I don't know, all sorts of issues with that one. So what was happening as we got into the late 20s, you had agriculture in free fall. You had construction that had dropped off, manufacturing that wasn't where it was. You also had a Wall Street that had gone through the roof. People were making piles of money. People could buy stock, so 100 shares of stock that would cost, say, $100, they could buy $100 with $1, which is great, as long as the price keeps going up. What happens if the price goes down? Oh, now we got a problem, because they're going to come to you and want the other $99. Do people have that kind of money lying around the house? No. So Wall Street didn't have a lot of rules, not a lot of regulation. It was hard in those days for anybody to get real information about the companies that they were investing in. So we didn't have the current rules that dictate how much information you got to have on a particular company. And so what it did is it left a tremendous amount of power in the hands of the Wall Street folks, and the average person could easily get fleeced. And unfortunately did. And so part of the problem was we had phantom companies that they didn't actually produce anything, but how would anybody know that were being sold on Wall Street? And when it became obvious that the money that stock was costing wasn't related to any actual production, it goes away, and the guys on Wall Street make a pile of money. The folks out there who invested lose a pile of money. So we didn't have, in this era, we didn't have the FDIC yet to secure the banking system and the money that you have in the bank. You didn't have an FCC yet. You didn't have any of that stuff. So what happened is you had all these factors that were troubling. Okay. One of the presidents leading in the 1920s was Calvin Coolidge. One day he was asked, "Why do you take a nap every day?" And his response was, "There's not much for a president to do. The economy's rumbling along at a great pace. Everything seems to be fine." The answer is there were a lot to do, but he didn't see it. And he saw no reason for the federal government to play a role in sort of stabilizing the economy and going after the excesses that were going on. So you had new technology was showing up every which way in this era. But the question was, you had tremendous income inequality. So the 1% controlled astonishing amount of the wealth in this country. And so it wasn't spread out. So the normal people couldn't actually be true consumers in this particular society. So even though new technology is showing up, there's a limited number of people that can do it. Those of you who are from this area, you know that Oldsmobile was one of the first car companies. Oldsmobile was in Lansing, and they, back in the early 1900s, 1901, 2, whatever, it cost $20,000 to buy an Oldsmobile. Who's going to buy a $20,000 Oldsmobile? Only the wealthy. And so the assumption is that the only consumers in society are probably going to be the people of wealth. Oh, not a great way to run a society as we know it today. So I said chaos in Europe because what was going on, Germany was going through the process of hyperinflation. Okay, so what was the reason they had hyperinflation? Just horrible story. It's horrible. I mean, if you want to look it up, it's just amazing. So what was happening is at the end of World War II, particularly the European powers wanted to punish Germany for starting World War I. So they put impossible requirements on reparations. So Germany had to pay back France, had to pay back Great Britain for the cost and the expense and the devastation of World War I. Well, if you're sending that amount of money out of the country, you don't have money to build your society again. So what Germany did, for whatever reason, they allowed hyperinflation to happen. So they were paying back the French and the British and others with devalued currency. That's the only way they could figure out how to make it happen. But what did that also do? It led to the rise of Hitler. So Europe was not buying the amount of American goods that they had bought before. So where we're going to go next is I'm going to dive into the Great Depression, because it's really important that we understand, because Federal Reserve and other agencies have committed that we will never, ever allow a Great Depression to happen again in America. And so we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what happened in the Great Depression and what Hoover did, what Roosevelt did, and sort of get our hands around that issue a bit. So that's where we're going next.